Another hot time on the conversation series hosted by Webster Marsh and Ron Kuzmar here on Get a Grip on Lighting. Today's show, their guest is Julia Gordon of JM Gordon Lighting Design. But before we get into their conversation, which I've already listened to and is fantastic, by the way, we want to tell you very quickly about our friends at Satco. Go to satco.com. That's right, Greg Eric, satco.com.
Oh yeah, sorry. Hey, I was just looking through this catalog. I said catalog, man. I actually keep one because Satco does it right. They do the light thing. They do the right thing. Any light fixture, any light bulb, any light part, any light component, anything lighting, Satco's got, and they even got a catalog that you should keep on your desk, ready to roll.
Yeah, yeah. So go to satco.com, check out their Starfish line of lighting controls. And of course, you want to be headed down to Dallas, Texas, September 13th through 16th. That's right. Nailed Innovation, the convention. It's happening. We're getting it on with ArcLight Summit. Yeah. So check it out. But for right now, at nailed.org, that's NAILD.org, right now, let's give it up for Ron, Webb, and Julia on the Get a Grip on Lighting Conversation series.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the conversation series on Get a Grip on Lighting. We're talking about lighting controls here. I am the self-proclaimed lighting control specialist, Webster Marsh, here with my co-host, Ron Kuzmar. And today we're meeting with Julia, who I think brings an interesting perspective to our conversation series so far. But Julia, do you mind just giving a quick pitch on who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm Julia Gordon, and I'm an architectural lighting designer. I've been an architectural lighting designer for over 25 plus years, uh, in which case I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of what lighting can do to a project, and also what controls can bring to your project.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. I think one of the reasons why I wanted you to join us today is because the conversation regarding lighting controls really seems to focus around who's responsible for lighting controls. And you, I would say, represent actually a majority opinion in our industry where lighting controls isn't necessarily the design responsibility of the lighting designer. There are definitely lighting designers out there who do lighting controls as a specialist or other groups that will take on that responsibility. But from your perspective, and correct me if I'm wrong, you kind of want to do the lighting design, not the controls components that go behind that lighting design. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, typically I leave that portion of the design, the controls design, I leave it up to the electrical engineers and the nerds to take over because they really do have a grasp on what the codes are for those areas and what the project is being built to for quotes. And so therefore, I kind of let them take over and let them do it.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess from an outsider's perspective, what does that relationship look like? Because we've heard so far from lighting designers who will do the work that is required to do lighting controls design. But how do you make sure, as a lighting designer, that the lighting controls still provide you the tools you need to be able to have a successful project?
Sure. I mean, for me, line controls, it really wasn't talked about as an architectural line designer until probably the mid 2000s, there and abouts, when the technology really turned into more of a computer based um, programming, if you want to call it that. I mean, back in the day when I started, we were still using ballasts for T8 and fluorescent fixtures, and we were still using rheostats as your dimmer controls. And that's all fine and dandy when you're at a restaurant and you have a bank of these little rheostats that you set every single night. But as time progressed, obviously everything has now turned into more of a computerized um, control
Hmm.
system. And for me as a lighting designer, I start looking into basically what does the owner want? It's called the OPR, the owner's point of view. And so it's really trying to draw out of the owner, what do you want this facility to feel like? What do you want this facility to look like? How do you want to sculpt the facility in lighting? And so it's really asking at the very beginning of the project of what do you envision to the owner? And then from there, we kind of put together a like a control intent narrative. A CIN is often what we call it, and it's just big, broad strokes of these light fixtures are going to be controlled by occupation sensors, and these controls are going to be, or these fixtures are going to be controlled by DMX. It's just big, broad scope initiative, and it's kind of like a narrative that we kind of put into the schematic design of a project at that point. From there, the very finished documents that we actually hand off is the sequence of operation, the SOO, that we'll hand off to, say, the contractor. And at that point, it's almost like a binding contract of that he has to program these fixtures to 5%, 1%. These have to be on a astronomical time clock, So it's one of these things, it's kind of like a check set that we, as a lighting designer, I have to go through of one, get the owner's initial take of what do they envision this facility to be, two, interpreting that and putting it into a narrative, and three, getting into the documentations of a system's a sequence of operations to hand off to the contractor.
I mean, that's all super helpful to know, and I think that a lot of people would agree with you that that is a proper format to get the conversation going with lighting controls. It sounds as though you kind of cut it off right before you actually write specifications or do drawings, though. It sounds like the sequence of operations is the most concrete document that you generate.
Exactly. And then at that point, we just kind of hand it off to the electrical engineers to hook it up, to circuit it, to gauge all the wires, to do what engineers are really good at, is figuring out the nuts and bolts of how a control system comes together.
I've heard a lot of stories though where this format causes some heartburn on the lighting designer because the electrical engineer or the contractor may not actually read the documents that you provide. And so I was curious if you've had that happen to you.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And from there, you just kind of have to punt when you're in the field and on the job site. And you kind of have to make it up as you go. But that's where it really helps if you have a good, like, working relationship with your electrical engineer, and really talking through how do you want these spaces controlled really helps. It's not like we design in a black hole. I mean, you're always going to Zoom meetings. You're always talking to the architect, the owner, the electrical engineer, the contractor. So as a line designer, you just can't hand off your drawing set to everyone. You just have to work with everyone. You have to be in these meetings and be cognizant of what the wants and needs are needed, and then conveying that to the electrical engineer.
So to expand on that a little further, um, you know, as you get through everything and you hand everything off to the engineer, a lot of these engineers are not, they don't have theatrical backgrounds, right? They're not lighting designers. So as the control intent continues to grow and you're looking at a deeper fixture resolution, whether it's a per fixture or a per foot or color changing, and there becomes a lot more of an artistic nuance that also goes along with the control sequence, right? So they need to have some of that ability to understand that nuance so that when they're looking at the control intent and the controllers and the different data distribution points, that they understand exactly what you're trying to do. So how do you find that relationship working with electrical engineers who don't have that sort of background in that level of advanced controls?
It's very funny to watch them get twitchy. They get really, like, nervous, like they see DMX on the narratives, and they literally start vibrating like they don't know what to do. And at that point, you just kind of have to hold their hands and just say, "Hey, look, DMX. It's just another protocol. It's just another language that we talk in controls." And that for a project, say like a casino, where it is heavily based DMX products, that's when we would call in a systems integrator. And that is where we would introduce the electrical engineer into the world of the integrator, and have them work with the system integrator so that they have all the nuts and pieces that they need to hook it up electrically. But know that there's a systems integrator that has their back when it comes down to controls and programming and actually seeing the vision of what the owner wants through.
Yeah. So
So I'm curious.
when do you bring that integrator in, right? So at what point do you find bringing the integrator into the project? And if you're bringing them in early, how exactly are you tackling that with the owner?
Well, as soon as we figure out from the owner what they actually dream of and what they really want, that's when we can then filter through and say, oh, this is going to be a heavily DMX system. Okay, we need a systems integrator. And so we'll actually write it in to our control intent. We'll actually write it into our narrative saying, you need a systems integrator. And these are the 6 people around the country that we recommend. And we'll write that in. And so when it comes down to the time of doing the sequence of operations that has all the DMX shown out, that's when we remind the electrical engineer and the contractor that you need a systems integrator to come in and actually do the turnkey startup of this whole entire system. And at that point, it's almost like a sigh of relief that I hear from the contractors, or it's a sigh of relief from the electrical engineers of, oh, thank God there's someone else who knows it more than I do. It's one of those like, oh, thank God.
Well, so I mean, that I think that that's a really important distinction, though, because a lot of people will see integrators as additional cost to a project. But from your perspective, at least if you introduce them early on enough, it's more of a relief to the people who are going to have to hover over this all of these components. And so that's a really good sell point right there for everybody to buy in on getting an integrator involved in the project. Additionally, it sounds like they're kind of taking on responsibilities that these other lighting designers that we've spoken to who do lighting controls work would otherwise be doing. So it's almost like a lighting controls designer being brought on via integrator and then implemented into the project.
And it's one of those things that you really need to start early on so that there's money in the budget. And so when they're doing the schematic design pricing, the GMP pricing sets, that the contractor knows he's going to have to price out a systems integrator. He's going to have to add dollars into that so that at the very end of the project, it's not a oops, we forgot, or whoa, we really need to find someone and who's going to pay for it, so that the owner's not saddled with additional cost at the end of the project is really where it comes down to.
So by putting the integrator into the specification, obviously it fits the end goal, right? It gets you to where you want to be. But how do you handle sort of that stopgap between the electrical engineer when the drawings are being done for schematic design, for construction drawings, for CD as they're going out, where the integrator is not yet on the project, right? They have not been brought in by the GC, and so while you've covered the cost sort of upfront in schematic design for the integrator itself, how are you handling potential changes that the integrator says comes in and says, no, this isn't right, we can't do it this way, we need to do this, and now there's additional controls costs? How are you handling that?
A lot of times that's just kind of out of my hands because it's the contractor who kind of dropped the ball at that point. And the most I can say or do is, or most I can do is basically demand it, or have them take a look and say, hey, do you really think you can do this on your own? And do you really think you can hook this up on your own and program it on your own? And give them examples of where it's gone horribly wrong and make them nervous as to, oh yeah, we really don't know DMX and we really don't know how to hook it up. So it almost forces you to um, get a systems integrator at that point in time. But then it's up to the contractor, you know, to eat the cost because they dropped the ball. It wasn't us in the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, having the integrator part of that conversation and part of the team essentially supersedes that contractor coming back and saying, no, I can do this on my own. I'm curious, though, if a contractor has come forward and said, but we have our own integrator.
I would say that's fantastic. And then I would definitely quiz them of, well, what has your integrator done lately? What systems have they worked on? What projects are they working on? Is it a 4-name spec? Is it a 3-name spec? Are they comfortable working with this manufacturer, that manufacturer, XYZ manufacturer? And it becomes a whole entire list of vetting them. Are they good enough for it? And oftentimes they'll do a decent job. Will they save the project money? Probably. Will the show or the DMX presentation be awesome? Probably not. But if you have a client who is cost conscious, this might be the best bang for your buck.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, we had Javid on before, and he said, if the project really is this big pie in the sky idea, that price should be brought up front and center and said, can you really afford this? And so I think it's the same thing with an integrator, because with an integrator, there's also cost. If you want like a custom graphical user interface that does a million things, that's a price. There's a price associated with that. They don't just get to say, I want it, and then they get it. So from your standpoint, if you really are going to kind of surrender this scope essentially to an integrator, part of your responsibility, it sounds like, is communicating that, yes, I can do that, but the price is going to be higher. It's going to be a greater
Exactly.
expense to achieve these results.
And you also have to figure out from the owner, what kind of integrator do you want? I mean, you and I are just strictly talking DMX, but there's also media integrators. So if you think of the big Jumbotron television LED dots that are on the side of the building that you see all over Las Vegas, that's a completely separate, different integrator altogether, which is a different fee structure, because now you're talking media content and trademark contents at that point. So it's one of these things you really need to talk to your owners up front to get that pie in the sky down to a manageable budget, essentially, to see exactly what they need and want.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so going a little bit further back to that conversation, a lot of people have a hard time extracting from owners what they want. And so I was curious if you had any good suggestions for achieving that.
I find that giving presentations that have a lot of pretty pictures within them, and trying to get a gut reaction from your owners is probably your best idea, because a lot of owners have a vision, but they don't necessarily know how to communicate it. But if you show them a pretty picture, they'll easily be able to say, "Oh, I like that red," or "No, that's too garish. That's too gaudy." So a picture is worth 1,000 words. It really is, and it tells a story. So if you can do a presentation for your client, you might be able to get a gut reaction out of them of whether they like it or not out of the pretty pictures you show them.
Mm-hmm. And then so I guess from those pretty pictures, you will then evolve into how do you control that? Because
Hmm.
one thing with static images that you don't get to see is motion. You don't get to see how the lighting is changing. And so do you then kind of go into other questions about how that system wants to operate?
Absolutely. A good example is we're currently working on a casino right now, and this owner, all he wants is red, white, and blue. That's all of the color changing he needs. That's all the color changing he wants. And we kept on asking, well, what about all the other holidays that are out there? You know? And he's like, there's other holidays beyond the 4th of July? And I'm like, well, yes, of course. And so it becomes, you start asking questions back at them and you start kind of pushing back at them. You start kind of challenging their notion of what is a holiday, and do you really need to be um, a very flashy holiday, or do you want it to be a subtle just transition of color from one to the next? And so it's is a conversation you really do have to have at the very beginning so that you can get a gut reaction. So in this instance, for this casino, yes, this owner only wants red, white, and blue. Great. But the nice thing about it is that he doesn't need a pixelation that's 1 inch on center or 1 foot on center. A pixelation that is 4 foot or 8 foot on center will do just fine, in which case it keeps your DMX universes down. It keeps your control costs down at that point when you know that all you have to do is control a 4 foot section of fixture.
And so, I mean, you used actually some lingo from lighting controls using DMX Universe. And so, I know a number of lighting designers who don't understand how DMX operates, but it sounds like even though you don't write specs, you don't do lighting control drawings, you still have a keen aptitude for how lighting controls operate.
Well, that also contributes to my background. So
Sure.
prior to being an architectural lighting designer, I was a lighting designer for theater and for television, and that is my actual degree. Received my Bachelor of Fine Arts in college in lighting design. So for a while, I was working on Broadway and off Broadway shows. For a while, I was out in all LA working on movies and televisions. And so DMX is for the theater world. That's a natural language. That's a language that you know. So more or less, I grew up with DMX. It was only until went into the architectural world because if you think back in the 90s, a lot of architecture back in the 90s was very heavily themed. So think your rainforest cafes, where it's heavily themed jungle. Or if you think of the casinos that were built back then, I'm sorry, this is going to be derogatory, they were Indian, like stereotypical Indian base that you would find out of the Hollywood 1950s and 60s. Okay. So if you think about it, a lighting designer out of theater can bring that magic to architecture. And that's how I was hired. And that's how I was brought into the architectural lighting world was because I had this theatrical flair that architects needed for their buildings at the time in the early 90s. So with that DMX, you need that controllability to bring your mood, your environment, your time of day into the story of the
Mhm.
environment that you're lighting at that point. And so you really do need that controllability with DMX. Not a lot of people, not a lot of designers have access to DMX, or nor were they brought up in DMX. A l- a lot of kids who are going through now that okay, back in the day, they didn't have architectural lighting as an actual degree. There's no such thing. And so usually most lighting designers came out of the theater world back then. It's only in the recent 2000s that, say, like Penn State or some of the New York SUNY Purchase, they now have an actual architectural lighting program that is a part of their education. So now you can learn about architectural lighting. That's great. It doesn't necessarily mean you get to learn about DMX though. So when you get onto these big projects, it really does help to have someone who's been in the theater world to understand how these kind
Mhm.
of controls come together.
Sure. So, but I mean, from that whole landscape that you're just painting there, I mean, it sounds as though to be the best that you can with these sorts of applications, you really should have an understanding of these systems, at least from an operational standpoint. Maybe not necessarily you need to understand that you need a terminator every 32 fixtures or something like that, but you know, at the very least, you should understand what's the capacity, what's the ability of your system.
Yes. And I think the only way to learn that kind of knowledge is by just doing it, unfortunately, and making mistakes and learning from your mistakes at that point in time. And also working along the side with people like ETC or Strand or anyone else who puts out DMX signals. And
Mhm.
working with those controls gurus out of those companies to really make your project sing.
And so, I mean, to kind of poke at that a little bit, you're talking about working with sales reps.
It could be sales reps, it could be the manufacturer directly themselves.
But you basically would have a conversation with them. You wouldn't just create this narrative and then punt it out into the world and expect it to happen. It sounds like you really have these conversations before you even put pen to paper, really.
Yes and no. Oftentimes we're working so fast that we're behind the eight ball all the time. So to have these conversations up front is impossible.
I think the entire industry can agree with you on that.
So it's usually on the 11th hour that you're calling your manufacturer rep or you're calling the manufacturer directly saying, help, I need help. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm putting these parts and pieces together. Can you help me walk me through this? So a lot of learning does come from the sales reps. It does come from directly from the manufacturer themselves.
So what about the integrators? Do you have any relationships with some of your, favorite integrators where maybe you'll lean on them instead of a manufacturer's rep or the manufacturer? I only ask because as a rep, right, they typically only have access to certain lines. So while they can assist you through things, they're obviously going to try and steer you towards certain equipment, whereas most integrators have access to everything and can sort of give you solutions that are more tailored to your specific applications.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I do call on a couple of my integrators here in town and say, hey, I have this project. This is what I'm thinking. This is the product I'm thinking to light this building. And sometimes they'll say, yeah, you could do that. And oftentimes they'll say, no, 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 no. There's a better product out there. You need to try this. In which case, I'm oftentimes invited over to their office. And it's usually a shootout of the side by side of the product that I was thinking about and the product they're actually recommending. And 9 times out of 10, the product that they're recommending is exactly what I need, exactly what I want. It may not fit the budget, but it's what I
Right.
want.
That's fair. Yeah,
Well,
it's
that's go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Okay, so I mean, it sounds like that's a great argument right there to grab an integrator, even if they're not necessarily specified on the project, but they can help you come to understand product, especially because they're the people on the ground dealing with this equipment on a daily basis. And to your point, they're the ones who are practicing, experimenting, failing, learning, and then taking that knowledge and helping you out with that because they've worked with it, as opposed to in a theoretical world where they've drawn the product on the sheet, but have they really actually held the product, tried to tinker with it, tried to make it do what they want it to do?
Mhm.
Yeah, and you also, to sort of as an integrator myself, to expand on that, right? There's also a lot of times where once you're done with a project and once you've completed it, you may speak to the owner for 6 months or a year after, but typically after that, you've moved on. You're on to the next job, right? Whereas as the integrator, a lot of times we're there through the long haul. We may be there for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So we see certain things, fixture failures, weird things happening, little ghosts in the system, things like that, you know, when you come back upon a similar design intent and you're like, hey, I was thinking about doing this, that's where an integrator can also offer, hey, I understand, but we've seen this happen now twice on these other jobs where at about a year and a half into the project, this weird thing happens with these, right? And offer that additional insight that may allow you to not necessarily, change the design, but maybe be leery of certain fixtures, manufacturers, controls, things like that.
Exactly. They system integrators are wonderful tools, wonderful knowledge-based people, and they're super nerds in my book, and I love them dearly. They're like the gurus of all DMX. They're the gurus of entertainment lighting.
Do you work on other projects outside of the entertainment world? Do you do big building lighting as well, like for the interiors?
Absolutely. So I work on anywhere from interior, exterior casinos, convention centers, hospitality, hotels, hospitals. I work on airports. I work on anything that needs lighting.
And so, with that in mind, do you have sort of a short list of which projects you need an integrator on and which projects you can do without?
Absolutely. I mean, if the project is heavily color changing product, then yes, absolutely. I need an integrator right then and there. If the project only has maybe a room or a space that needs color changing, then no. Normally either I'll be on site programming it or I can walk at least the contractor through how to program it, but oftentimes it's the owners who say, ooh, I just want a little color dial and I just want to play with it on my own. And we're like, fine, that's a okay. But for large projects, as of recently, it's very interesting, the change in architectural design style. So back in the 90s, it was heavily themed, architecturally heavily themed, entertainment heavily themed. And then in the early 2000s, it turned into everything was rainbow colored, color chasing, RGB color, because that's when LEDs kind of started to hit the market, but it was only for color changing at that point. And then I'm finding now in the 2020s and 2015s, everything has gone to monochromatic. A lot of buildings are just being white light, whitely lit. Maybe the exterior might have some color changing, but it's not the gaudy garishness of it used to be back in the 2000s, where it was always color changing. So I find that design is evolving currently right now. A lot of my
And
projects are just
where do you think we're evolving to?
Well, currently right now, a lot of my projects are purely white light and just very monochromatic. So even the architecture itself is a white or an off-white creamy color or a beige color or wood color. It's very fascinating how everything is turning to very white or the space is very black. So a lot of black light fixtures or black ceilings or black walls and surfaces, very dark color. So I wonder how color changing will come into these spaces other than for maybe circadian rhythm. So the tunable whites, so going from 2200K all the way up to 6500K. That's the other realm of it doesn't have to be color changing RGB. It can be circadian rhythm changing. So I think there's a need for DMX to be doing that versus a 0 to 10 volt style system.
I want to poke that a little bit further because I know there's a lot of opinions regarding tunable white and which protocol is appropriate for it. So I was curious if you had any thoughts regarding that.
Well, it's kind of all dependent on the space. So if it's, say, a school room, and they have tunable white in there, a 0 to 10 volt signal will be just fine because it's not like you are tuning the space very precisely incrementally. Okay. That can get away with a 0 to 10 volt signal, and you just push your button for 2700, 5500. You can just push a button, be done, maybe use a little dimmer slide. Great. Fantastic. Walk away. It's all set up, contractor friendly, don't care. But for spaces that really require circadian rhythm, and I'm thinking of, say, NICU, baby hospitals, okay, or I'm thinking of rooms for sensory deprived, so autism. You really do need a DMX system in those rooms to tune it just right so that the babies get the right amount of sunlight or circadian rhythm sunlight throughout the day. Or for those who are challenged, they get the right amount of light within the day or within the space that they need. So at that point, you really need that granular DMX control.
So I mean, it's not an all or nothing situation. I mean, there are a number of people that I've spoken to who are like, it must be DMX, or you don't need DMX. You can get away with 0 to 10. But it sounds like it's application specific as opposed to just I'm done. One or the other.
Correct. Yep.
And so, there's a lot of pushback with the 0 to 10 regarding intensity, because arguably, if you put it in that classroom and the teacher hits 3200 and then drops the intensity of the fixture, it's not going to maintain that 3200 most likely. And so is that a big concern?
That's different. Nope, that's different. So even if you dim a 3200 fixture down, it will maintain a 3200 Kelvin temperature. However, there are products out there called warm to dim, in which case you take a 3200 fixture, and as you dim it down, it warms up like an incandescent light bulb. So it gets oranger and oranger. That is a very different request or requirement for it's very different
Well, so
fixture.
you're absolutely right. Warm dim is a different application. I'm not referring to that. I'm just talking about if you have two colors maintained by 0 to 10. So you have one intensity, the other intensity maintained by 0 to 10. If you set it to a middle ground and one's at 10% and the other's at 80%, but then you drop the intensity of the fixture, they're not going to drop down at a rate that's going to allow to maintain that color temperature. There's going to be a distortion in that color temperature as one intensity value changes.
It'll get muddier. It'll get grayer.
Yeah.
It'll feel like a dreary afternoon in Seattle.
Right. But I mean, so for an application such as a basic classroom where you just want simple tunable, you don't need to match circadian entrainment and make sure that that is the right color temperature. It's not that big of a deal if it's not precisely 3200 Kelvin.
Correct. Where
Okay.
it would be necessary, say, in a NICU situation.
Sure. So I mean, when it's a health consideration, that's when you really want a more robust dynamic control protocol.
Correct.
Yeah. No, I think that that's a fair point, and I think that that's, you know, a lot of, again, this is a discussion going on right now, and a lot of people are pushing in one direction or the other, and I think that having a more leveled approach, saying they're both applicable, it just depends on what you're trying to do, makes sense. And I think, you know, a lot of people should hear that in our industry, because my perspective, at least with any controls protocol, is that there is no one solution fixes the problem. Everything has its own need. I mean, like you said with DMX, we have DMX in our industry because of the demand that it meets. It is trying to provide a very specific kind of control where 0 to 10 would not be able to provide, and even in some cases Dolly would not be able to provide.
How often do you see Dolly come up? How often do you see it?
Excellent question.
You know?
I mean,
I
from
mean,
my standpoint, Dolly in North America is trying very hard to enter and sustain itself. It does exist, and there are great applications for it, such as tunable white, not in a entertainment or a snappy need, but in a, you need a digital protocol to control something. It's a great application. If you need, you know, the LLLC, that's another great application for it. But you know, it 0 to 10 has just crowded it out in our marketplace. And so but I'm curious if, Ron, since you've kind of dealt with it more in the front lines, whether you're seeing it.
Yeah, so I am not seeing any Dolly really in our area, right? So we saw a push from Dolly probably about 10 years ago, and we had a couple projects that had it on it. They were a couple of theaters, and the Dolly ended up getting ripped out, and they ended up going 0 to 10 because they weren't happy with what they were getting out of the Dolly system. But yeah, I haven't really seen it too much since. I've heard a couple rumblings here and there, but it seems like everyone tends to just push it out with 0 to 10 or you know, DMX if they can, depending on the manufacturer.
What's your stance?
I find that Dolly, it's not there. There's nothing in America that says you should be using Dolly. However, it is the stepping platform for Wi-Fi. Any of the Wi-Fi, Bluetooth controls that are now out there on the market, it is kind of like the stepping stone of, or the launch pad of what we see as Wi-Fi and Bluetooth controllability right now.
Sure. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of companies that have basically rebranded Dolly with their own special blend, and they call it something else, but it's really Dolly in the background.
Right.
It just doesn't speak true Dolly. So you can't take like a Dolly native fixture and put it on that system. You have to have it speak that specific brew of Dolly. But I mean, I think that's another reason why Dolly got crowded out in our industry, because other companies came in and said, well, it's good, but it's not perfect. So we're going to perfect it, make our own version. And then also at the same time, nobody will be able to join our project. So,
Yep. And that becomes that one name spec that basically cuts everybody out, so you can't get good competition at that point.
Right. But I mean, as far as things go, I think you bring up a good point with wireless, though, is that wireless is also just kind of coming in and superseding wired dolly applications. Because if you want that kind of dynamic control, that near limitless capacity for individually zoned fixtures, then why not go wireless? And I'm curious from your perspective, because a lot of people are also saying either pro or con wireless, what your stance is on wireless lighting control systems.
Again, it's application specific because with wireless, if it's an existing building and it's going to be more of a hassle to pull wires through a conduit across a building or across a ceiling or up a hard wall, you might as well go wireless at that point in time. If it's a retrofit type of installation, just know that your limitations are. I mean, a building is kind of like a Faraday cage. So your wireless may not get out of that room or may not all the way through the building as much as you want. So you're going to have to install a lot of repeaters so that all these fixtures talk to each other. Now, if it's a brand new building from the bottom up, go wired. It's just so much easier to do Cat 5 and just wire everything everywhere because you can pull and you can make your chases where you need them. Where
Mhm.
wireless really sings is actually exterior lighting.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So a lot of the IECC and ASHRAE requirements for exterior is dimming your fixtures down or just even turning them off at the end of the night, or have occupancy sensors on them. Where wireless controls actually sings because you can get 1,000 feet of line of sight as far as a crow flies, and so in between each fixture you can get a whole entire site onto a wireless system. And now you have controls that will dim on, dim off, have occupancy, can be turned off at night without pulling all these extra wires. I mean, or having low voltage drop between light fixtures, which is used to be a concern at that point in time. So I feel like wireless for the exterior, dynamite. Do it. You know, save
Well,
yourself
and
from
and
pulling.
are you speaking specifically about pole lights, or are you also speaking about landscape lights, for instance, ones that are strapped to trees?
Pole lights, landscapes, bollards, you name it. Anything that has an electrical connection, use wireless if you can, if that manufacturer allows you to.
Yeah, I mean, I I really like the wireless. I like wireless mesh. I like it a lot outside. It does have a lot of good applications. The hard part that I have with wireless is that in 2 years or 3 years, when you lose a fixture for some reason, someone backs into a pole, truck driver knocks it over, whatever happens, and you have to replace that fixture, you now need a tech to come back out, right? You can't just, it's not a plug and play device anymore. You need someone to come back out, put that device back onto the network. So it's not as easy as something that's got 0 to 10 or something like that, where the electrician can just wire it in and walk away, or they want to move something. So that, I love the wireless mesh, but that's the only sort of weird caveat I have with it, is that you have to have a technician come back out to those sites.
And that's true with any technology, to tell you the truth. I mean, if you think about your computer gets updated and upgraded every 6 months. That's the same thing with LEDs and with technology and controls. Everything is being updated at about every 6 months. So even though you bought this product 2 days ago, it's already outdated. So that's
Yep.
that's kind of like the world we live in at this point in time. Technology just is racing along so fast.
It's true. I will say though, what, like with DMX, it's very easy to pre-address a fixture and then send it to the owner or the electrician and have them just plug it in, right? So there are certain applications where certain protocols make it a little easier.
Mhm.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I just kind of want to encapsulate what we talked about here today, because I think this, you bring a really interesting perspective on this topic of lighting controls and where the responsibility lies. But from your standpoint, I mean, as a lighting designer in its truest form, you're really just guiding the design, you're not really hammering out the details of lighting controls. You're not in the trenches programming everything. You may program one or two small little wheels or something like that, but ultimately the person you're going to rely on the most when it comes to lighting controls is an integrator or a very savvy engineer who's going to be able to take your documentation that you've constructed that takes that owner's expectation and create the documentation that's going to specify the system that meets that control intent narrative or sequence of operations. And so really there is sort of this line divide between lighting designer and lighting controls designer, which is something that, you know, there's definitely groups out there that have that name, but for the most part, it's kind of this amorphous existence out there. Lighting controls integrators can take it, sales reps can take it, engineers can take it, you know. But at the very least, what you're doing is talking with those people early on in the project to make sure that they're aware of what needs to happen. They're guiding the project correctly, and you can continue to do what you do best, which is making sure that the lighting is going to work.
Correct. And I don't know everything about controls. I know a lot about lighting, so I like to stay in my own lane and do the things I do best, and then pull in the people I need to help me along.
Well, thank you so much, Julia. This has been a really great conversation, and I hope to see some of your lighting designs in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.
You got to go to satco.com. Every day I check out their website because there's always something I'm looking for, and Satco always has it, Greg Eric.
That's right. You might find some unique item. You might find some common item. It doesn't matter. Always check Satco because they have stock of it. They have great pricing. They have service to match it and options. And you said their website, but they also got this pretty little catalog.
Come
Check it
on,
out.
man. There you go. And, you know, we got to tell you, NailedCon's coming up September 13th through 16th, Dallas Market Center, hooked up with ArcLight this year. Come on down. It's going to be super hot. That's right. Nailed.org. Go to NAILD.org. And of course, hats off to Web and Ron on the conversations here series. And thank you to Julia Gordon of JM Gordon Lighting Design. Bye for now.